Hi, Dexter. Welcome, and thank you for making some time to be in this wonderful edition of JS World Conference USA.
Thank you for
Um,
having me.
I've had the pleasure to talk to you about Svelte in many times while at Passion People. But for anybody that's new to what you have been up to and maybe that doesn't know you, can you tell us a bit about yourself and maybe your story with Svelte? How did you get into it?
Right. Yeah, so I've been looking for a good reactive application platforms basically for a long time, like since Backbone and before Angular. And when Angular showed up, I was ready to dive into it, but I wasn't really liking it. And then React showed up and it was sort of okay, but that's sort of where it kept. And then at some point, a friend of mine introduced me to Svelte. And I saw it and I immediately fell in love with it. It was back when it was version 1. And every time it's a big, like every new version was a big shift, but it's for the better. Yeah, and now for years I've been a big fan. Still, sadly, no projects yet by customers, but in personal projects I've been dabbling with Svelte.
Making our
Yeah.
way, of course. Was it love at first write or love at first compile? What attracted you the most, the syntax or the speed, or both? Could be.
It was the syntax at first. So Svelte always tries to keep very close to basically vanilla HTML and JavaScript is sort of like you would make a template language, but then have it dynamic and responsive and reactive. So it was for love at first sight, yeah, because it's so simple. You have an idea and you can immediately express it without needing to sort of dive into how it's supposed to be done in framework X.
One thing that Svelte has kind of set, let's say, a different bar from the ground up was that it is designed with like modernity in mind, right? Like it's not dealing with some of the affordances that frameworks that try to target older browsers or older stack is trying to do. It's more like
Right.
a modern, forward kind of thinking.
It's a forward-thinking framework, I would say, yes, but in the sense that it doesn't isn't scared to break stuff in this like IE11, which is a very old browser with a lot of drawbacks if you want to support it. I think it supports it in some cases. I'm not sure of the details, but in Svelte, it's sort of, but it stays very close to the foundation where it lies upon. If you write React, for instance, you're writing JavaScript functions with return JSX. You need to know all these these extra layers on HTML and CSS and JavaScript. With Svelte, it's plain HTML, it's plain JavaScript, it's plain CSS, unless you want it to be different. But yeah, that's what also reduces all the sort of mental loads in the mental model of programming in these in Svelte.
I want to ask you about a recent, and I realized it may be strange to ask you about a post by the creator of Svelte himself, but bear with me. Maybe you can give us some insight, let's say, into how the Svelte community sees this. So he posted recently a gist where he, well, it's not recent actually. It's like from, I think, a year or more ago, where he gives the truth about Svelte and how it's not really just a UI framework, but that he sees it as a language itself. So the combination of the syntax, the compile step that it's required, but also how that transition of it, this is not just a collection of functions and scripts you use, but a whole mindset shift, how it can unlock certain things. Is this something that you see making its way in the whole Svelte community?
Yeah, I think so. It's sort of hard because it's very meta in this sense. I do see Svelte, it's sort of a framework, but it's also a language because it compiles into plain JavaScript, and like the code you write will end up differently. It will end up inside of basically the compiled bundle. But yeah, it in that sense, you're not writing plain HTML. It has added benefits, and in this sense, it is a compiler. But I think in those senses, Vue generally also could be a compiler, especially in the, what's it called? I'm not up to date.
Single file component.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It will be similar to Svelte in that way, but you still always have this extra layer of how to deal with, interact with the component itself and update the state, which Svelte all leverages this away from you. So because you expect variables to be dynamic, you update a local variable, you want it to be reflected throughout the DOM wherever it's being used. And it does that for you, and that's why it's a language. And these paradigm shifts you mentioned, they do sort of you have to have a moment, or you have to play with them in order to sort of grasp them and see how you use them. Lately, there's this new way of using use enhance, which is a great feature, which in SvelteKit, and it allows you to enhance a form, and this form basically without JavaScript still functions as a form. But if it is Svelte-based, it will be totally different. So this way of writing these applications, these progressive applications, making sure something works with, even if people have JavaScript disabled, it's very tricky to do in current frameworks, and you always have to think about it. If you have the right mindset and use the right paradigm, you sort of can wrap your whatever flair you want in your JavaScript-enabled website around all the basic functionality. And it's not easy to do in a React setup.
And I think that this is very relevant for, we just had as part of the conference program a panel on the web performance and how the new metrics of web core vitals are actually going to, now that we are in May, take effect and really show how they are going to be influencing page ranking, etc. Things like first input delay, like this is really crucial now for pages that rely on forms and where users are probably wanting to interact with the form almost immediately, and maybe the hydration step is taking too long and it gets affected. So in this sense, probably this is going to be a massive win for that, because the form, it works, right? It will be
indeed
nice.
And even like in most React apps, you have to, like it's in the Rich Harris's talk about reactivity, where like an interactive component or an input element in React, you have to really think about how to design this component that it's sort of functionally well, and if you're rendering 10,000 components based on your input, it will lag, and in Svelte it decouples everything in a way you expect it to be.
And how is Svelte achieving this? Because this seems, of course, since the early days of JavaScript-based frameworks, right? Let's say we went from this imperative kind of model where we were going and getting a button or getting a class and then modifying its properties, and into the reactive kind of model. But still, none of the big competitors out there, none of the big frameworks so far, seem to have managed the level of, well, true reactivity that Svelte offers. Maybe what can you tell us a bit about the bit under the hood, let's say in general terms, for the audience members that are not too familiar with Svelte? What makes it different?
Right. So it's compiled. That's basically the difference, because Vue and React don't necessarily need to compile in order to render. So that means Svelte knows your variable that you're using to populate this name field, for instance. It knows that where it's being used, and it can track those updates. So, and it does that through the compiler. So it makes sure every time your variable changes, it updates all the right places. In React, you have this model of this big loop. Basically, it's the old way of doing React, but still, bear with me. You have this one big loop where everything needs to update from the root component on, and all the state trickles down. It's very costly. It's less costly because it's in JSX, so you're not actually using the real DOM, but still it's very costly. And in Vue, it's a mix between the two. I'm not too familiar with Vue, but You might
Yeah,
be
Vue 3 now is really making a heavy use of the proxy API to
right.
provide essentially a reactive feeling, but still. So I take that Svelte doesn't use, for example, then the concept of a virtual DOM or shadow DOM.
No, it's using the DOM. So whenever you write a component, and it can be a very simple component, let's say a script tag with where you define your variable, you export it so you can address it from outside, and you display it in HTML. And this will make a few JavaScript functions which will be able to render the component and update its state according to like how the Svelte API works. And this makes sure like it will call the right DOM methods in order to update the state whenever it needs to.
That really feels like, and this is to all audience members that haven't given Svelte a try, really do, because it feels like you're writing just JavaScript and HTML with a tiny couple of different things in the syntax that actually explain some of these magic in a bit,
Yeah.
but the sensation is quite refreshing in many ways, because it feels like going back to basics. And I wanted to touch a bit on that concept of going back to basics, because the simple nature of Svelte syntax and how it is refreshing not to have to learn, as you mentioned, JSX and the concept of a virtual DOM and the concept of state management as a tool. It probably means that Svelte will be very friendly for newcomers to web development. Is that something that the community has seen?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen that, but depends on where you look, I guess. But what I do see, like newcomers, really fresh people coming into web development, there's so much to learn, like CSS and HTML and JavaScript alone, without any framework. So I guess it makes it a bit easier but there's also people who learn React, for instance, and they don't have a clue what's going on underneath there. And you'll write worse application if you don't know what's going on. That's the same with Svelte. So I guess for any framework, you need to know your basics before you can really go into the framework on a better level. But
now, pretty much all of the major frameworks nowadays have a server counterpart, right? Or a meta framework counterpart. So in React world, we have things like Next.js. In Vue, we have Nuxt. In Angular itself, well, it has a massive amount of things around it that provide different levels of opinions, let's say, right? When you are writing, or structure when you are writing your application. For the case of Svelte, since the beginning, there was this idea of having something like it, and Sapper was, I think, what the community started to use and develop. Now, recently, SvelteKit has taken the lead as the official kind of approach to not only have a small Svelte app, but let's say a more full-fledged app. What is SvelteKit? How would you describe it to our audience?
SvelteKit is basically it grew from the fact like there was a bunch of use cases people asked from Sapper, which it wasn't really capable of doing, and then SvelteKit was created in order to tackle those things. So SvelteKit is sort of an octopus where it can be deployed in many different contexts in many different ways, and allow the developer just to focus on the app itself and not on how it's deployed and where it's running. So it's basically a Svelte site builder. I'm struggling to find a proper name, or like a server-side rendering, or if it needs a server-side rendered component, or it could be statically generated and pushed to this content delivery. Content delivery network. If it needs to run on Lambda to render some functions, and you split out specific paths which you can deploy to Lambda and other parts on the CDN, it can do all those things in a very seamless manner. It's still fresh, of course. There are some use cases I'm missing in there, but
again, we see that idea of you're mentioning now, like really modern in the sense that they have entered the collective imagination of the development community, like server-side rendering, statically generated and distributed in the CDN, maybe serverless functions. So again, we're going to like that modern side.
Right.
And that's quite refreshing to see a framework that is taking that step. There's also a quote I wanted to ask you a bit about what you had in mind, because Rich Harris in a recent presentation in Svelte Society, he mentioned that the Svelte kit and Svelte was the first serverless first framework. So having this idea of serverless in mind.
Right.
So this now essentially starts to blur the lines between your typical front-end engineer concerned about UI and maybe like performance on just the front end, which apparently is how Svelte itself started, right? As a UI presentation framework. And the lines are now being blurred into what you can do as a developer, writing more server-side code, writing more functions code. Where do you think maybe this is going to go to? Are we going to really see a convergence of, you just write one thing and it doesn't matter if it's running locally or else?
It could be, I hope so, in a sense, but in the other sense, in order to do this, you need to abstract away some of the details on the platform you're running. So, like I'm running into issues regarding that. Using a server push or a WebSockets, it's getting trickier because then you need to know on what platform you're running. But in a sense, the world of deploying it gets more and more complicated because of like all the different layers developers introduce, and making sure your app as a site runs with all the best practices doesn't really matter where it is. You just swap out an adapter basically, and it's going to run somewhere else. That's
in a sense, the coziness that we have in the front end and in the web platform of all these standards and common things that browsers have to implement as part of the platform, that doesn't exist when talking about serverless functions, right? It exists, the idea of a serverless function exists, but not the implementation details maybe that differ. So these adapters are quite a nice addition. What can you do with them? Is this something like you add a function to your Svelte kit project and you have essentially like you can write an API there, or are they more of a concept like server-side components from React where you have some rendering even involved?
Yeah, you can do all of those things.
Oh.
So you can write parts of your API in there. Depends on, of course, where it's talking or where it's storing data. But there are some hooks. You can, for instance, guard some sort of server-side secrets basically inside of these hooks, and which call your other external, S3 buckets or whatever to return some data, whatever, stuff like that. And you can render your components server-side, or you can even render components server-side and then publish it to a PDF rendering service and then returning the rendered PDF, for instance, all within Svelte.
So this really sounds like a really nice complete offering. Like, from our work together at Passion People that we are also experimenting a bit with both. Well, Vue has been the cornerstone of what we are developing, but we're experimenting with Svelte more and more. What would you say is the rule of thumb, let's say, for someone who is trying to decide, maybe starting something fresh? Let's not go into the migration idea right now, but starting something fresh. What would be the rule of thumb, let's say, or your recommendation to go for Svelte? What are some of the conditions or the ideal scenarios that you would recommend?
It doesn't really matter. Anything works in Svelte, and I would recommend it for everything. And then just start with Svelte kit in this time, unless you don't really need the server-side state. But in general, you'd want to use Svelte kit because it does all the things. It renders to static files if you need it. It renders on the server if you need it, or you can do a split approach. It could statically generate one bit, but the rest it will be leaving that for the client to render. So maybe some client-side state before anyhow. So yeah, use it for any project, any and all, and it will be very, very, very
You'll be
nice for
happy.
you. Yeah.
Yes. So what can you tell us about what excites you from the future of Svelte? Let's say, is there something coming in the roadmap that for you is like, oh, I really can't wait to get my hands on that?
Well, I would like some more control in the adapter space for some server side, some more advanced server side connections, where WebSockets and server push would be an option. Now I'm wrapping it inside an Express server, so I'm proxying all the Svelte requests, and I'm handling the rest in an Express situation, which is not ideal. But so I'm looking forward to more sort of being able to hook into the request. But on the Svelte front, it's very solid. Like I might be a bit behind on everything. I'm not sure, but everything is in there, and it keeps getting better, I guess. So I'm always surprised by what Rich and the team come up with.
It is really a framework that seemingly for many people started to come like out of nowhere, and then you hear about it pretty often, right? Like how many of the good ideas, I think also some lessons learned from other frameworks are making their way into, okay, we don't have that backgrounds to deal with, or those prior decisions. We are just starting. Let's get the best out of all worlds. I wanted to ask you about one particular feature that, especially in the Vue ecosystem and with the introduction of Vue 3, it is a common question on that ecosystem. And I wonder what is the state of that in Svelte. And that goes with template and TypeScript. So typing of template of variables when you're using them in your template. So is this something that you can do with Svelte? Because from what I remember, like support for TypeScript in Svelte has been there from almost a year ago, if I'm not mistaken. For, of course, the script part. What is the story there on the templating side?
So I believe like the properties you mean, the
Yep.
typing properties. Yeah, that works. That works from when typing or TypeScript was introduced. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So not only for writing your code, but also for exposing exposing the properties with typed properties, basically.
I know I'm gonna be giving that a try because that is one of the features that in the Vue community we're having like discussions around it with should it be a tooling concern? Should it be a language concern? So great to hear that in this case Svelte is supporting it. If you had the chance to yourself, besides the adapter stuff, add one feature to Svelte or SvelteKit itself, is there something in your wish list, maybe for in case any of the Svelte core team members watches this recording?
I'm not sure. No, I wouldn't add anything. But also, like you can do a lot with use. You can do a lot with all the transitions and animations. It's all been very thought out, and it's been very in-depth discussions. And yeah, you shouldn't want to have to add something to your framework if it's not there. You should be able to deal with it. And
nice way of thinking. Let's using the tools you have at your disposal. So
yeah, it's sort of in the from the Python language. Guido van Rossum, the creator, was always very hesitant to add something to the language because, like, adding stuff, you can never really remove it. So it's probably having a general solution to a lot of these cases. It's better than just to add it because people want it.
At least not without breaking stuff for people. So, well,
yes.
With that in mind, I want to thank you again for your time today, Dexter. I hope we have a chance to follow up in a future edition of JS World Conference. Where can we hear more about what you're up to, and maybe where can we hear more about Svelte in general?
So go to the Svelte Discord. It's very active. There's a lot happening there. It's too much that I don't follow everything, but yeah, and people are very helpful there, and yeah, I'm mostly active on Instagram, I guess.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll find a link to your profiles in our website somewhere over here.
I think so. Yeah.
But for the time being, thank you once again, Dexter, and well, we'll talk soon. Thank you,
See you
everybody.
soon. Ciao.